Welcome to the Alan Stang Report. Daily news, views, and interviews conducted by prize-winning journalist, author, and investigator Alan Stang. Now, here is Alan Stang.
Thank you, Steve Knight. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the program. This is Alan Stang. Tonight, a program we've been waiting for almost a full year. Gary Allen, the author of None Dare Call It Conspiracy. We'll be back with this distinguished economist after these important words.
Here once again, Alan Stang.
Welcome again to the program, ladies and gentlemen. Regular listeners to these nightly broadcasts will perhaps remember that the premiere broadcast of the Alan Stang Report on KIEV took place on September 20th when the station went 24 hours. We originally were supposed to start on August 20th, but you know, with all the clearances that are required from the Federal Communications Commission in Washington, we were delayed in getting on the air. The station was delayed in going 24 hours for a month. We were supposed to start out on August 20th, and in preparing for that first show, I thought, understandably, I want to start with a blockbuster show. I want to start with an explosion. I want to get a guest so dynamic, so knowledgeable, so informed and exciting that it will just blow the roof off the station. And I wondered, whom should I invite to be the premier guest on the first program of the Alan Stang Report? And suddenly I realized the answer is right in my own backyard. My close friend, Gary Allen, who lives, of course, in the Southland, in the Los Angeles area, would be the perfect guest. At first, it hadn't occurred to me because we are so close. Sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees, but suddenly it hit me. Gary Allen has to be my guest. And so we scheduled Gary Allen to be the first guest on the Alan Stang Report on these nightly broadcasts on KIEV. A few days before we were scheduled to begin broadcasting, I got a call from Mrs. Allen, and Mrs. Allen told me, well, you have no guest for next Monday. I said, well, why not, Barbara? Why don't we have a guest? And she said, Gary is in the hospital. And it turned out that Gary Allen was in the hospital. He was in the hospital for many months, eight or 9 months, as I recall. And he came as close as you can come to leaving us. That's how bad it was. And many of us spent some of our important time on our knees, hoping that he would be saved. And he was. He fought his way back. He is now restored to health. A tremendous human story. He's back with us, restored to health, and he's our guest this evening. A year late, and it's been worth waiting for. Gary Allen, it's great to have you with us this evening.
Gee, I don't know if I can live up to that build-up, Alan. Better late than never.
That's right. Okay, my friend.
Sorry, I'm a tad late.
You're a tad late, but you finally made it. Okay, you are the author of so many blockbuster bestsellers. Richard Nixon, The Man Behind the Mask, The Rockefeller Story, Ted Kennedy, In Over His Head, and, of course, undoubtedly your best-known bestseller, None Dare Call It Conspiracy. And I wonder, that book came out in 1972, as I recall, Gary. Compare the situation when you wrote None Dare Call It Conspiracy, when it first came out, and the situation today. Are you able to do that? Is that a fair question?
Well, given 5 or 6 hours, I think it is, Alan. Basically, there's good news and bad news. The bad news is that the plan for world government and the surrender of our sovereignty is marching along with more momentum than ever, I'm afraid to say.
Now, that would be the bad news, of course.
That's the bad news. The good news is that when I brought that book out and we started talking about the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, virtually nobody had heard of either of those groups. And within the conservative movement, outside of the small coterie around the John Birch Society, most people thought it was just cuckoo stuff. Now, the entire right wing, I think, with the exception of William Buckley's crowd, understands and believes that the mega bankers are calling the shots in every administration, and that they're really the people that are running the government.
Well, of course, William Buckley is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations.
Yes, that may have some influence over the fact that he ridicules the power of the Council on Foreign Relations. I think they decided the best way to deal with Mr. Buckley was just to co-opt him and invite him into the organization. That organization has run wheels within wheels within wheels, and I doubt very much that Mr. Buckley is any part of the inner wheels. But I think they knew that Buckley's Achilles heel was his ego and his desire to be recognized by the liberal establishment as the legitimate conservative alternative, the nice, safe conservative that would not ask the really tough questions.
Along these lines, the conspiracy is expert in running its own opposition, in even creating its own opposition. Can you explain that, Gary Allen? So many people are confused by this.
Well, I think put yourself in their shoes. I guess it goes back to Machiavelli, and maybe Machiavelli picked it up from somebody else. I don't know, but it's been used time and again to the degree that you can. You want to control both sides. You want to, if there's two political parties, you want to do everything you can to control both political parties. And of course, you do this in this country mostly through money, because all political movements, left or right, whatever, are always starving for money. And if you read Carroll Quigley's book, the Professor Carroll Quigley, who's since passed away, but he was close to the inside of this group and saw their papers. And in his monumental tome, Tragedy and Hope, he makes it clear that he doesn't really disagree with any of these people except with their secrecy, but he says the Morgan, J.P. Morgan interest back in the 1800s found out that the way to control American politics was to finance both parties and both sides of every issue, and that way the people can be manipulated, and that's, money buys power.
In the face of all this, though, Gary Allen, the good news, again, is that more people today are daring to call it a conspiracy. Would that be...
Absolutely. The key new right people in Washington, people like John Lofton and Howard Phillips and Patrick Buchanan, all agree that the problem is those key mega banks in New York.
What is the conspiracy, Gary Allen? What is it? Suppose you were talking to somebody who has perhaps heard of the conspiracy, but is wondering, well, what is this group that he's talking about? How could you define that?
Well, that again, boy, that's a tough thing to capsulize, Alan. But I think basically it's a group of people who seek power and money. And they know that when you don't have a completely free market, the way to get that is to control government. Government is the best investment you can make, by a politician, because after all, they're spending almost $1 trillion, and you want to make sure it's spent in ways which you like, which protect and expand your worldwide economic empire.
Who runs the conspiracy today?
Well, a lot of people, you can Only the people that actually run it and the people around them actually know. But I think it's quite obvious that it's run in this country, I think, primarily by the Rockefeller interests and those allied with it. But there's also a considerable amount of evidence that while Britain has lost much of its indigenous power and certainly dismantled its empire, that the financial district of London, called the City of London, is still extremely powerful and may really be the ultimate power, economic power in the world today. Again, Alan, I know you spent a lot of time researching this, and I think everybody starts off like I did, thinking it's crazy, it can't be true.
In fact, when you started looking into this, as I recall, Gary Allen, you were a liberal.
That is correct. That's true. And I had a close friend who was pumping all this stuff at me, and geez, I felt sorry for him. I thought the poor guy lost his marbles, so I set out to show him how fouled up he was. And it turned out, he knew a lot more than I did. I thought with being a history major from Stanford that anything that was worth knowing I already knew. That simply was not true. And as you know from studying this, someone once analogized that it's like walking around a golf course and you find divots everywhere, and the golf course is, the putting green is just torn to pieces. You know somebody's been there in front of you, and they're a lousy golfer, and they're doing a lot of damage, but you're not sure you can identify them. And I think it's the same with a conspiracy. We can have all kinds of debates about who is the ultimate power and what the pecking order is. And the truth is that we, in general, know who the players are, but there's a lot of inside information that no matter how much study that people like you and I do, we'll never be able to answer certain ultimate questions.
Gary Allen.
Here once again, Alan Stang.
Gary Allen, you mentioned that the goal of the conspirators is world government. Can you flesh that out a little bit? What would this world government be like? What part would the United States play in such a world government, for instance?
Well, our founding fathers gave us an independent, sovereign country. That's what the Revolutionary War was about. And there are some that think, believe it or not, that was a mistake. And there are others that just think that, use the excuse, well, with atomic bomb and nuclear weapons that we have today, that sovereignty is old-fashioned, and that what we have to have is a world government, and with that obviously comes a world currency, a world court, and a world army. And what it means is that decisions involving the survival of the United States of America would not be made by Americans.
In other words, I think it's important to establish, Gary Allen, to underline the fact that when we talk about world government, because of the world government propaganda, the term world government has been made somewhat respectable. But when we talk about world government, we are talking about the abolition of our country. It would no longer exist as an independent entity were world government to be imposed upon us.
That's right. We would just be the equivalent to California as a part of the federal union. We know that there's a lot of things that California would like to do that it can't do because all the power has been preempted and funding has been preempted by Washington. We would be certainly in a world government, we would be a minority with a disproportionate amount of the wealth, and they simply get a vote to strip us of our wealth because the other countries of the world would look at us with envy and greed and decide that we'd have there'd be a world income tax. If you think the federal income tax is bad enough, how'd you like to be paying a world income tax established by countries who are eager to loot us?
One question I get very often, Gary Allen, I'm sure you do too, is this. Many people find it difficult to understand why people like the Rockefellers, you mentioned the Rockefellers, why people like them would collaborate with and support the communists who are trying to overthrow people like the Rockefellers. People find it difficult to understand why the Rockefellers, who are supposed to be so smart, would do that. Could you explain?
Well, first of all, there is an absolute mountain of evidence, going back, starting actually with the Bolshevik Revolution, that they have been doing this. So we can argue about what their motives are. You might think it's one motive, and I might think it's another motive, and somebody else might think it's a third. But the one thing we do have is an absolute mountain of objective evidence that they have been aiding the Soviet Union and its satellites since 1918.
For example,
let's take the largest, most modern truck factory in the world is located on the Kama River in the Soviet Union. That project was financed by a loan from the Chase Manhattan Bank, the Rockefeller's Bank, in conjunction with a loan from the U.S. government. It was promoted by Mr. Casey, our current head of the CIA, and Mr. Schultz, our current Secretary of State. And now those, not only do they make trucks in that factory, they make tanks, and those trucks and tanks are committing genocide in Afghanistan. And the Rockefellers did it with their money and with their political influence.
Here's a question that I honestly would like to know the answer to. People have asked me this question. I honestly have to reply, I don't know. It's this. Who is really running the show, Gary Allen? Are the people that we often refer to as the insiders in this country, the David Rockefeller types, to continue with the example that you used, are they running the show, or are the communists running the show? Who is the boss in this collaboration between the insiders in this country, like David Rockefeller? I guess you could name W. Averill Harriman in that group, Armand Hammer, people like that. Are they running the show, or are the communists running the show?
Isn't that interesting? Well, I don't think there's any doubt that for a long time the big money people were running the show. Now you can certainly make an argument that it's sort of like let's take a hypothetical little town, and you've got the country club set and you've got the local mafia. And the country club set, some of those guys don't like to work. They let the mafia run drugs and look the other way while it happens. And so they let the mafia run the show. And then eventually the thugs become so strong, the thugs take over from the preppy types. Now, you can certainly make a case that that is what is happening or has happened.
Well, then, if that were the case, Gary Allen, would not we be seeing now from the Rockefeller group, if we could call it that, from the insiders, the Rockefeller types, would not we be seeing a reaction that we might characterize as a sudden revelation to the extent that, hey fellas, we've been had. We've got now to turn our policy around and begin to suppress these people in the communist countries. But there's no indication that I am aware of that they are doing this. In fact, they are intensifying their aid to the communist empire.
Well, at this point, there is the possibility that any time that we want to do something that's in the best interest of this country, let's go back to when our mutual friend Congressman Larry McDonald was murdered and shot down out of the sky, and the United States did absolutely nothing. It could be that there's an old saying in the banking business, if you owe me $1,000, I own you. If you owe me $1 million, you own me. We've loaned so many billions to the Soviet Union and its satellites. They can say, look, we can break your bank tomorrow if you cause us problems.
So in other words, we're talking about the possibility that the insiders here have created a Frankenstein
that they can no longer control.
They can no longer control.
That's a possibility. I don't say that that's a situation that exists, because I think that's one of those things that you and I can't find out about, that we can only speculate about. But I think it's certainly a possibility.
Another fascinating guest over these microphones a few months back was a gentleman known to both of us, Dr. Anthony Sutton, who, as you know, is another great scholar uncovering so much information along these lines. And recently he's come out with his series of little books on what he calls the Order, which deals with Skull and Bones, the secret society at Yale, which he believes, as I understand it, is the core of the conspiracy. Do you share that belief? Is Skull and Bones as important as Tony Sutton says it is?
Well, I tend not to think so. I tend to think that there's no question about it. The number of people that have been in Skull and Bones who then turn up on the left in this country certainly defies random selection. But Skull and Bones is taken from the top seniors at Yale every year, and let's face it, the top seniors at Yale every year are people who, in many cases, have come from, and in almost all cases, are going places. So that's a heck of an elite group to begin with. If you take the top 15 or 20 or 25 seniors at Yale every year, you're going to have some people who are going to be very powerful people. Whether that is the core, I would say it's a possibility, and you can certainly make a case for it. But then there's the possibility that it's simply an extremely fertile recruiting grounds for the conspiracy.
Gary Allen, let's take a moment to listen to a couple of fascinating messages.
KIEV, Glendale, Los Angeles.
Here once again, Alan Stang.
Remember, friends, that we still have some copies of Kenneth Coleman's 995 booklets entitled America's Endangered Banks and U.S. Financial Institutions in Crisis. Very valuable booklets. They are yours if you will just send us a contribution. They're $9.95 booklets. Just send us a contribution and tell us what you want, and we'll be happy to send you copies of Kenneth Coleman's books. Kenneth Coleman, by the way, will be our guest over these microphones next Monday. He is, of course, the editor and publisher of the Reality Theory newsletter. Other books, his expose of the United Nations, so many films and film strips. Ed is going to give us a portion of his day-long seminar on the central banking system. He calls it Your Money and War. Your Money and War. It should be fascinating. Why not join the Co-Producers Club so that you can attend this meeting and hear what Ed Griffin has to say? Call 714-543-6666. That's 714-543-6666. Gary Allen, how does the present uproar in South Africa fit into this scheme for world government that you are analyzing for us here this evening?
Well, Alan, you and I have watched the mass media for many years, and we've seen a lot of scandalous stuff, but I've never seen anything match the vitriol that is being poured on South Africa at the present time. I have never seen a campaign to destroy anyone that's as hot and heavy and nasty and full of half-truths, quarter-truths, and outright lies as the attack on South Africa. And the revolutionaries in South Africa are run by and armed by the Soviet Union, trained by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's number one target in the world next to the United States is Southern Africa because first of all the oil going to Europe out of the Middle East has to go around the Cape, and if the Soviets cut that off, they have a stranglehold on Western Europe. And secondly, there are a number of very exotic metals such as chromium and titanium and palladium, which through an idiosyncrasy of nature are found primarily in two places in the world, Southern Africa and the Soviet Union. And without these semi-precious metals, you can't build jet engines, you can't build rockets, you can't have a functioning high-tech economy. It's been claimed, and I think that there could be a lot of validity to it, that 2 years after the South Africa goes under, the United States will go under.
You'll be interested to know, Gary Allen, that on the evening of Friday, August 30th, my guest over these microphones will be Robert Dale Wilson, who is the director of the Office of Strategic Resources in the Department of Commerce in Washington, and he's going to tell us in considerable detail what these minerals are that South Africa has and why we are so dependent upon them.
Well, that should be an outstanding program.
Can you compare for us, Gary Allen, the Carter and Reagan administrations in terms of the conspiratorial machinations that you've been analyzing for us?
Well, there is a cult of the personality that surrounds President Reagan. There's no question that he is the greatest speaker, a mesmerizing personality, and his speeches have been, utterly fantastic and pretty much remain so. But the actions have been far different than the campaign promises. The first thing he did after he became nominated was pick a vice president who comes out of the old Rockefeller wing of the party. Now, there'd been a war for at least 40 years within the Republican Party between the conservative wing and the internationalist liberal establishment wing. The Goldwater wing, if you would have it, versus the Dewey wing. Robert Taft was the conservative while he was alive, and this war for the heart and soul of the Republican Party had gone on for, as I say, 40 years, and it was sort of money versus the people. The majority of the people active in the Republican Party were conservative nationalists, but the big money was coming out of the big Wall Street banks. Well, finally, with the death of Nelson Rockefeller and the passing away of most of the other liberal lights or political oblivion, finally this 40-year battle was won in Detroit. And geez, I remember you and I stood side by side as George Bush was introduced as Ronald Reagan's running mate.
And I recall, Gary Allen, you remind me that when Ronald Reagan, candidate Reagan, came unexpectedly, as I recall, correct me if I misremember, he came the night before he should have come. It was a violation of tradition. The nominee wasn't supposed to come at the time he came. He came specifically to tell us of his choice for the vice presidency, and when he uttered the name George Bush, I heard from the throats groans from the conservative Republican delegates from around the country. I heard gasps, groans of astonishment at the choice that Reagan had made. Do I remember that correctly?
You certainly do. Well, he had promised everybody that he would pick a philosophical twin, and the report is that he was visited in his room by Henry Kissinger and Walter Cronkite, and that they sort of explained the facts of life to him and told him that he had to pick Bush or else he would be, quote, gold-waterized, end quote, by the national media. Well, we all remember what that was like, and Ronald Reagan certainly remembered what that was like, and he caved in right there. And when he became elected and started picking his staff, of course, he has to delegate tremendous amounts of authority. And Reagan even, I think, delegates more authority than most presidents. Howard Phillips of Conservative Caucus likens him to somewhat of a ceremonial president, not unlike the sovereign of England.
Just yesterday, Gary Allen, in the Washington Times, I saw a story which said that George Bush was named Republican of the Year by the very, very liberal Ripon Society, which attacks conservatives and presumably attacks the president's policies, and that George Bush actually raised money for this organization, which I presume it will use to continue those attacks on the president's ideas.
Well, not only that, but as Paul Weyrich of the Fund for a Conservative Congress said, they tried to get George Bush to speak at a number of conservative events, and he turned them all down. But he did show up at and we used as a $1,000 a plate fundraiser for the Ripon Society.
What is the one thing the conspirators fear most, Gary Allen?
An informed electorate. I know our friend Larry McDonald always believed that they had a firm grip on the presidency and on the executive department, but that the hope of America lay in the House of Representatives, and that if you had enough pro-Americans in the House of Representatives, you could put the blocks to this thing.
What advice can you give people listening to us now? What can people do to prepare for the economic chaos that you write about in the Gary Allen Report every month?
Well, first of all, I think you've got to save yourself, because if the people on our side are broke, they sure can't help politically, can they? On the other hand, there are those who do what Congressman McDonald called vulture economics. In other words, they kind of sit there and say, whoopee-doo, this is going to happen, and I know how to make a lot of money out of it, and politics is a dirty game, and I don't care what happens, but I've got my gold and silver and my gold and silver stocks, and so let it come, I'm going to get rich out of it. I think you've got to do both. You've got to be active politically. It doesn't do any good to be the richest person in the concentration camp. What are you going to spend the money on? On the other hand, I think we're headed for runaway inflation eventually, and for a number of reasons, I don't think there's any doubt that gold and silver are going to go way up, and I think at that time an awful lot of it is going to be owned by our enemies. We're going to make sure our friends own a lot of it too.
Gary Allen, let's take a moment to listen to some very important gastronomic news.
Here once again, Alan Stang.
Gary Allen, let's go to the telephones now and see what the people have to say. And let's go first to Dave. Hi, Dave.
Yes, hello.
Hi, you're on the air with Gary Allen.
Hi, Gary. Listen, Gary, I read your book, None Dare Call Conspiracy, and I found it very interesting. But to me, the real problem is that our corporations and government are run by elites. And you have conservative elites and you have a liberal elites. And the question to me is, how do you break down these pyramid structures that are inherent in both? I think that we have to do that. And there's a book called Megatrends, which says that this breakdown is occurring now. And I think that's hopeful, because I think for so long in this country, you know, whether it was conservatives or liberals, it was always away from the people. It was always controlled by a few group of people. And I think that if we can break up these pyramid structures and make it somehow more open to people, I think it would be a great thing.
All right, let's see what Gary Allen has to say, Dave.
Well, I think that it's... I understand what you're asking for, and I would agree with the sentiment, but I would disagree with the author of Megatrend's conclusions, because as you look, we see more and more concentration of political and economic power, not a breakdown of it. And where are these conservative elites? Name them for me. I don't know anyone who you would call conservative who has great economic and political power in this country. There are some very influential people on the state level, and you have senators like Jesse Helms, and certainly there's some local political power behind people like Helms, but I don't see it on a national level. I don't see a big national magazine that's conservative. I don't see any TV networks that are conservative. Where is this diffusion of power?
Dave, thanks so much for calling. Eric.
Thanks, Alan. Yes, Mr. Allen, it seems like the British, you mentioned at the beginning of the show the power of the British bankers in our country, and it seems like this started with way at the beginning of our country when Alexander Hamilton, who was born on an offshore island of the East Coast, was able to get a central bank put in General Washington's administration, and wanted to establish banks as a power in our country. My wife had occasion to visit the Cayman Islands, which are just southwest of Cuba, several years ago, and she said it was just like a jungle with a bunch of British banks sticking up with some resorts. And I'm wondering if there are other islands in the West Indies and the Caribbean where this situation exists with the British banks, and what is going on with all these British banks just offshore of the United States. What role is this playing?
Well, I think when Britain became so socialistic that the British banks set up in places like the Caymans and Bermuda and Switzerland to run their affairs. It's run out of London. The power can still reside in the city of London, but they wanted to get away from the taxing power of the British socialist government, and so they sort of diversified, and you have not only building banks down there, but you also have these banks that are nothing more than a post office box and a plaque in some attorney's office, and that way all of the taxes that they've levied on the rest of us, they can operate and escape themselves. In this country, the Rockefellers and others use the ploy of the tax-free foundation, and then later, I think, has more or less switched at least part of their operations to offshore operations.
Eric, thanks so much for calling. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Alan.
Hi, you're on the air with Gary Allen.
Okay, Gary, you were at Stanford. I was at Berkeley, and I was one of the radicals. I wasn't a heavy, but you've been discussing the people at the top, and I experienced some of the people, you might say, at the bottom. And I can tell you from my experience, and I was never an insider, but the leadership was apparently the same people that showed up at the Russian Revolution. They were mostly New Yorkers. And once in a while, although they were very secretive, and many of them I'm sure were sincere leftists, but once in a while their mask would slip away, so to speak, and you could see unmitigated cultural hatred toward I'll say the average American citizen. And believe me, I think that's something to be thought about and feared.
Well, there are fanatics within every group and in every religion.
These people, most of them are lawyers now. They aren't crazies at all.
Well, of course, I guess some of them, like Mario Savio, wound up destroying themselves, chewing Bible soaked in LSD while they were in jail.
Well,
but
he was before my time, but believe me, most of those people have become lawyers, and I'm sure they function quite well.
Well, I'm sure they're all members of the ACLU, too.
I expect that they are, but if you could have seen occasionally the hatred, the cultural hatred, it was something I've never experienced in my life, and the only accounts I've read that compare are the accounts of the Russian Revolution. And I'm sure you know what I mean. You've probably read those yourself. But
That's
anyway,
an interesting observation.
Mike, thanks so much for calling. Eric.
Yes, hello.
Hi, Eric. You're on the air.
Mr. Allen, we all know that Ronald Wilson Reagan is a counterfeit conservative and that he has appointed more members of the Skull and Bones, Bilderbergers, CFR, and Trilateral team than all other presidents combined. And he's done more to surrender our sovereignty to global government than Carter, Nixon, and Ford combined. My question is, should not Reagan be impeached for high treason? And by the way, do you know that Bill Buckley and George Bush are Skull and Bones boys, full-fledged members of the Brotherhood of Death, a very important part of the Hegelian right?
The Hegelian right? Well, I don't accept that Skull and Bones is right-wing.
Well, I guess perhaps Eric means, Gary, by the Hegelian right, that this would be the phony right created as part of dialectical materialism.
Right, contrived conflict.
I think that's a good point. And as is George Bush. Incidentally, I'm starting a book about George Bush.
Oh, good.
It's kind of interesting. We checked books in print, and there has never been a book by or about George Bush. So unless somebody else gets the presses before we do, we'll have the first book about George Bush.
All right, what about Reagan and impeachment?
Well, I mean, that's ludicrous. First of all, when he hasn't appointed more CFR trilateralists than all others put together, that's simply not possible. But he's certainly appointed, I think the last count I saw was 79, and since then he's appointed Winston Lord, the president of the CFR, as our ambassador to Red China.
Also, Eric, I think just practically, it's quite obvious. Suppose the president were impeached and were driven from office. Well, then who would be president? George Bush.
That's an interesting thing.
Mr. Allen say
So
that.
what would be the point of it?
Interesting thing. Tonight I had a conversation with Dr. Arthur Robinson. And Dr. Robinson is one of the nation's foremost experts on cancer. he has a very interesting background in that he was the protege and got his Ph.D. at Caltech under Linus Pauling. Later became president of the Linus Pauling Institute, and then was fired by Pauling because Pauling was pro-communist and Art was anti-communist, and he wound up suing Pauling and getting a major settlement. But Dr. Robinson is certainly not part of the cancer establishment. He's done a lot of mouse studies, and I remember he has told me that the most successful mouse studies he ever had was based upon a diet by a woman in San Diego who was given 4 weeks to live and went on a vegetarian diet, amounted to almost eating grass, sprouts and things like that, and she lived 12 years. And he said the best success he ever had with mice was this vegetarian diet. Well, anyway, I had a long conversation with him tonight, and he thinks that President Reagan, and he's a supporter of President Reagan and likes him very much, but he thinks that Reagan's time with us is probably very limited. He said they have not been very candid about colon cancer. He said,
well, that's certainly unsettling.
And certainly, Mr. Allen, we can't get away from the fact that that this administration is crowded with these trilateralist international.
I said that.
Gentlemen, I beg your pardon. I must interrupt you.
I think that there's a major mistake by overstating the case.
Here once again, Alan Stang.
Gary Allen, would you take a moment to tell the people how they can subscribe to your fascinating monthly newsletter, the Gary Allen Report, which I strongly urge you to do, friends. It's absolutely fascinating.
Well, we'll be happy to send anybody who calls or writes to you, Alan. We'll be happy to send them a free copy so they can see whether it's something that they think would be a valuable thing for them to subscribe to.
All right, friends, I don't see how you can lose on a deal like that. For a free copy of Gary Allen's newsletter, the Gary Allen Report, simply write to us, the Alan Stang Report, P.O. Box 1220, that's 1220, Alta Loma, California, 91701. Again, that's P.O. Box 1220, Alta Loma, California, 91701. Just write to us and tell us that you would like to see a free copy, a complimentary copy of the Gary Allen Report, and we'll be happy to send you one. I think you're going to find it fascinating, and you're going to find it more valuable than reading any dozen newspapers you can get your hands on, because probably for the first time in many cases you are going to find out what's really happening in this country and around the world when you read the Gary Allen Report. Gary Allen, thanks so much for being with us. Good luck on your book about George Bush. I can think of some very interesting titles, which I'm sure you've already heard from other commentators, and I hope you'll come back now that you're fully restored to health, with God's help, that you'll come back and bring us up to date.
Alan, I really appreciate being on, and it's great to be alive, and I feel great, and we're going to make it back, and I want to appreciate the prayers from you and so many of my friends that brought me back from death's doorstep.
Thanks so much,
I love you all.
God bless you. Good evening. Until tomorrow, friends, this is Alan Stang. Good night.